Final Destination 3 is a 2006 horror sequel directed by James Wong. The plot will be familiar to anyone who's seen even one of these films before. So in this one, a group of people are about to ride a roller coaster when a character called Wendy, played by Mary Elizabeth Winstead, has a premonition that they're all going to die on this thing. So she gets off the ride, a bunch of people follow her, but some people stay on and die horribly once the coaster gets going. But for the rest of the movie, the survivors are stalked by death and begin to die in more private accidents. Now, I gave the first two films in this series 3 out of 5, which is just slightly better than average. So I guess coming into this, the jury was still out for me as to whether this series was capable of producing a truly great horror film, or whether the same good but not great standard would continue to prevail. Having seen all of these films many, many years ago, I think I already know the answer to this. But sometimes the mind and the memory can play tricks on you, and when you watch the same film years apart, you do often get a completely different experience. Now, of all the accidents that kick off the Final Destination films, the concept of people dying on a roller coaster was definitely the scariest for me, because I am terrified of these things in real life. I've only ever been on one roller coaster. It was when I was 16, and it wasn't even the worst type of coaster. It was one that went like this with big dips, but there were no sections where you went upside down like you see in Final Destination 3. But never again. It was a horrible experience. There was one point where I was going on a downward slope and I thought my head was going to bang on the ceiling of this tunnel that we went into, but ouch. I'm terrified of planes as well, which is the focal point of the first film. But I guess at least with roller coasters, you don't have to go on them, whereas with planes, if you don't face down that fear, then you're never going to go on holiday. I think the big acid test, though, with me and roller coasters would have been if I'd have been on a double date when I was growing up and maybe the others had wanted to go on a roller coaster, and then I would have had that dilemma then. Do I face down the fear or risk looking like a wuss in front of the girl? But thankfully that was a situation which never arose. The whole opening salvo takes roughly 15 minutes to get through, which is a long time if you think about it, but every second that Wendy is slowly edging herself towards this ride, spotting all these clues that something's going to go wrong, I can totally put myself in her shoes and feel her discomfort, because this is how I would feel anyway, heading towards one of these things. I'd feel like I was heading towards my own execution. I hate those mechanisms that come over your shoulder and lock you in place on any ride, actually, because once you hear that click, that's it. There's no changing your mind about going on, not without looking like a complete tool anyway. When Wendy starts losing her shit and she's getting off the ride and the attendants going around from car to car trying to get the mechanisms up so people can get out, there are some people who can't get off in time. They're trying to lift the mechanisms up, but they're locked in place, so they can't get off. So they have to just stay on the ride and die. And I think that's one of the scariest aspects of this sequence for me. The roller coaster section as a whole is definitely the scariest part of Final Destination 3, perhaps the only scary part. I think that's the trouble with this series on the whole, because every time I watch one of these films, I often feel that once I've got past the big spectacular action sequence in the first 20 minutes, the rest of the film won't really then have much more to offer than a bunch of smaller scale accidents that won't be as good. The premonition in this film is definitely longer and more terrifying than I remember. In my head, the roller coaster train did little more than just go around a couple of bends and then crash and burn like Killian on The Running Man, but in reality it seems to cover the entire track before it finally comes to a halt and everybody's dead. In that time, people have been impaled and had their heads bashed in, and there's a bit where the train sort of stops upside down and people are hanging on and a couple of people fall off and die from the height. I mean, it's really effectively filmed. I know most of it's CGI and wizardry, but it's still really well done. I said in my reviews for the previous two films in this series that the accidents as we see them in the premonitions don't always match up to how they happen in reality for the characters. I can't tell if that's the case again here, because there's a jump cut from when Wendy's being led away from the ride to the point that she arrives back in the rest of the fairground. So I guess I've got to give this particular movie a pass on that score. It's nice to see Tony Todd pop up in a little cameo. His voice is coming through the tannoy on the ride. As for the rest of the characters, I only really like the main two. Mary Elizabeth Winstead is an actress that I've always really liked, especially because of the role she did when she was in her 20s. I don't think I've seen much of her since she's been in her 30s, apart from Birds of Prey, which she did quite recently. Kevin, played by Ryan Merriman, This is an actor I remember from Halloween Resurrection. I think his performance in that film is hugely underrated by the horror community, as is much of the rest of that film, actually. I'm glad to see that being in that didn't stop him from going on and getting good roles in other films, because he's a decent enough actor. His character, Kevin, is not treated very well by women in this film, though. I mean, he seems like just a normal, happy-go-lucky, good-looking guy, but his girlfriend's going to dump him at the start of the movie. Then after the roller coaster incident, Wendy is really mean to him. Then once he gets on friendly terms with Wendy, there's seemingly no chance of a romance. I mean, come to think of it, there's never any romance in these Final Destination films. You'd think that somebody by now would have come up with the idea of having one last roll in the hay before death comes a-calling. But clearly at the end of this film, Kevin and Wendy have not seen each other for quite some time. Come on, guys, sort it out. I mean, I don't watch these films just to see people become monks and nuns. Whilst we're on the subject of the ending, though, I did appreciate the efforts of this film to give us a second big set piece to finish things off. I think that's something that the first two films could have benefited from as well, actually. Although I do wish they'd saved the whole train idea for use at the start of a future movie, so it could have had the full 15-minute treatment, because I love trains. It's a very macabre way to finish things off, though, having Mary Elizabeth Winstead, of all people, on her hands and knees, about to be run over by a train, albeit in a premonition. Maybe she could have rolled out of the way the second time around, armed with the knowledge that she has. Although, given what we know happened to Alex after the events of the first film, you would think that Wendy is a goner anyway, because she hasn't learned how to flatline and bring herself back, like the characters from number 2. I'm guessing that there's no way Kevin and Wendy's sister could have survived, though. Going back to what we were saying earlier about Carrie announcing her intentions to dump Kevin at the start of the film, Carrie being Kevin's girlfriend, it's an odd thing that they threw in there, because it just means that for the rest of the movie, Wendy has to carry around this awkward secret that she's never going to reveal. So it's just a kind of plot point that goes nowhere. I have a theory that maybe originally it was intended that Wendy and Kevin would have a romance. So Carrie giving Wendy that information, therefore, at the start of the film would make Wendy feel less guilty about getting with Kevin later on. But if that was the intention, then it clearly got derailed. But no, seriously, if you're going to leave that line of dialogue in there from Carrie, then surely it makes more sense for Wendy to be the one who sucks up to Kevin after the accident, and maybe he doesn't want to know. And then later on, Kevin could get suspicious as to why Wendy suddenly likes him, and then the secret gets revealed. And if they've got together at this point, then even better, you could have some serious drama, maybe on the train at the end. But they don't do that. When it comes to judging the more individual deaths in the middle of the movie, I think my favourite by far is the one with the sunbeds. Not only is it delightfully gruesome, but it's got a nice slow build-up, and I love how ditzy those two women are, to the point that they can't even see the irony in the fact that they're boogieing away to that roller coaster song. Chalon Simmons, who plays the blonde of the two, I saw her quite recently in See No Evil 2. She's very talented at playing stupid women, it seems. I like Lewis's death as well. Fucked up! The only character I don't like is Ian, the kid who works at the warehouse. It's just ridiculous that by that point in the movie, he doesn't believe what's going on around him. And what is his intention when he turns up at the festival, by the way? It's just odd. And that character definitely brings the film down a peg or two, actually. Another thing that could be called a negative, depending on which side of the fence you're stood on this, is the lack of originality in the storyline. At least with the second film, they've connected it with the first one. They've introduced this whole ripple effect. They've had the characters actively try and find ways to cheat death and succeed at it. But when it comes to the third film, it's as if they've just decided, right, we're not expanding the storyline anymore. We're just going to have the first film, but with roller coasters. Now, I guess if you're going to the cinema on a Saturday night with your friends, you might just want to turn your brain off for 90 minutes and watch a more simplistic version of Final Destination, and that's fine. On the other hand, you might be on your own at home binge watching these films, and I think by the time you get to the third one, you're going to be wanting them to mix things up, explore the mythology more, explore the rules of death more. So I could easily imagine that the fan base for these films are a bit split on this point. I think it just depends on your taste and circumstances. One idea I had of how you could spice the films up is to have one where you start the movie showing characters dying in individual situations, and we don't know why because we haven't seen them survive a big accident yet. But then you could have that in a flashback sequence at the start of the third act. I mean, I haven't really thought it through completely yet. I'm just kind of throwing it out there. On the whole, I do like this film mainly because of the roller coaster sequence and the train sequence at the end, and one or two of the deaths in the middle. But the characterizations and the character relationships do hold it back a little bit. Right, let's get to the bag of terror then and find out how that translates into a score. So we've got 1, 2, 3 bloody axes for Final Destination 3 out of 5. The same score I gave to the first 2 movies. It's kind of weird how we just keep getting the same score with these films. If you had to ask me, if you had to push me, I think I might just pick this one over the previous 2, despite everything I've just been saying, actually. But yeah, it's weird, isn't it? Very, very consistent in its quality, this series. Now, I do have a pin for the horror locations board because this film takes place in Pennsylvania. It's quite ironic given the fact that I just did my Rocky rankings like a week ago. So stay tuned for that. That will follow in a moment. But until next time, cheerio, bye-bye.